We start with our interview segment and take a look at the campaign season with special focus on the Kansas governor's race and the U.S. Senate race in Missouri. And joining me for that is Dr. Patrick Miller, a political science professor from KU. Dr. Miller, welcome to Ruckus. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We are told by a lot of analysts there's a great deal of enthusiasm across the country for this year's congressional races for the House and the Senate. Do you sense that kind of enthusiasm in Kansas for the gubernatorial race?
I think there's definitely a lot of enthusiasm just across the board politically. Certainly, if we look at the primaries, I mean, Kansas was a little bit different this year in that both parties had contested hot primaries that were unpredictable in some ways, and turnout was definitely up, especially for the Democrats. Certainly more Republicans voted than Democrats, but the advantage that Republicans had in turnout was far down. So certainly a lot of enthusiasm, especially for Democrats this year.
Let me ask you about the three major candidates for governor and get a thumbnail reaction from you about each. Let's start with Greg Orman running as the independent.
Greg Orman obviously ran for Senate, actually twice before, first as a Democrat, dropped out, then as an independent in 2014. He's an interesting candidate to me. We have two polls in the race, and he's polling distant third, far behind Laura Kelly and Chris Kobach. He's at about 10%, give or take. He labels himself a centrist, but he's pretty consistently liberal on policies. And in fact, to the extent that he's tried to draw a contrast with Laura Kelly, he's actually, and his camp has been hitting her from the left on guns and Medicaid expansion and voter regulation. So to me, the most interesting thing is how he balances liberal policies with creating a centrist image, and the question of who he draws from in the end, which ultimately I think will be Laura Kelly.
We'll get to that in a moment. What about Democrat Laura Kelly, a state senator, next door neighbor to former Governor Kathleen Sebelius?
Right, so she's been in the state Senate, first elected in 2004, represents a pretty Republican district, wins tough races. A very credible candidate, a centrist Democrat. She obviously just got the endorsement of the former Republican governor, Bill Graves, which was a real coup for her. She's about tied with Kobach in the polls, and I think she has enough money to run a race, but really, the dynamic between her and Orman and how many votes go to him as a potential spoiler will be interesting.
And how about Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State?
All right, Chris Kobach, high-profile national politician. He's become one, certainly in the Trump mold of Republican conservatives. In many ways, a very unorthodox campaign. I mean, talking a lot about really national issues, immigration especially, which we think of as more of a federal issue, heavily self-funded by his lieutenant governor candidate, yet he's viable in the polls, tied with Kelly. His campaign is very interesting to watch and very unusual.
He was sort of Trump-like before there was Trump on the
national absolutely
scene.
Right.
There's nothing new about the way Chris Kobach behaves politically.
Nothing new. He was talking about a lot of the issues that Trump ended up talking about, not trade as much, but certainly immigration and potential voter fraud long before Trump was. And I think in style, they're quite different. They're both smart politicians, but also very good at putting on a show. And I think Kobach knows how to do that and get media attention.
Kobach is far more articulate than President Trump.
Oh, yes, I mean, for sure.
Greg Orman, you mentioned, we talked about. Does he really have any impact on the race? Is he going to hurt Kelly or Kobach or either, or both?
Well, I think after 9 months of campaigning and advertising, he's been on the air for quite some time, to only be at 10% has to be a disappointment for him. And he is simply not in contention with Kelly and Kobach at this point. He really is in a distant third. And even with independents, Laura Kelly is beating him almost 4-1. And so I think, with how Orman is running, I don't see how he draws from Kobach or hurts Kobach. I see him as someone, leftist policies, centrist image, certainly drawing more from Kelly.
Than from Kobach, right. I would assume. Do you think at this point, and I realize no one knows for sure, do you think Kobach is the likely winner, given what you just said about Orman and Kelly?
I think Orman puts a bigger ceiling on Kelly. He definitely limits her room to grow and possibly gives Kobach more room to grow. That said, in the two polls we have right now, Kelly and Kobach are tied. So I think long-term, watching their numbers and exactly how much Orman gets, it's going to be very interesting math.
Let's jump over to Missouri and that important Senate race. Incumbent Claire McCaskill running against Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley. polls are close, but I think McCaskill, at last report I read, is 3 or 4 points ahead.
Right, there was just a poll out yesterday that had her up 4. And the polling has been consistently tight in this race. I mean, definitely, I think, average it all out, you would call it a toss-up. Sometimes she's up a little, sometimes he's up a little, and there definitely is a lot of money, many millions of dollars in outside spending coming into the race. So it's clearly quite close.
Is it really important to McCaskill how she, and to voters, how she comes down on the Brett Kavanaugh nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Probably
she won't
not.
say. At least she said she's going to make a statement, I think, later this week. But does it really matter to her voters and supporters?
No, I mean, if you look in the polling, most people who care about Supreme Court nominations, they are solidly partisan anyway. And whether you're for or against Kavanaugh or anyone else, you probably know who you're voting for in the end. I mean, that said, with as close as the race is, if there are 100 or 1,000 voters here and there, they may be a very small chunk for whom that might really be a swing issue. It might be something that she cares about.
A great interview. Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate your time.
Sure. Thank you.
Come back and see us again.
Thank you.
That is KU political science professor Dr. Patrick Miller. Now let's meet the panel and start a ruckus.